Hey, what is up? My name is Chris, and welcome to Coding in Public. Today we're going to build out a fully responsive and accessible Accordion component with just HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. As you can see here, I've got a component up top here, and then I've also got another Accordion component down below. There's a couple things I want to make note of first of all. Number one, you can see how this one has a default behavior where the first panel is open by default. And if I open the second panel, they both stay open. I've configured this second one to instead have them all closed by default, and when I open one and go to open a second one, it actually will close the first, so it only allows you to have one panel open at a time. I'm going to show you how to do this by writing just normal HTML with a couple of classes, and then we're going to call a JavaScript a file that we're going to write that will then add all these down and up arrows, all the styling for the components themselves, and allow us to set default behavior when we initialize it from the HTML. So we're going to do all that here in just a second. Now, I do want to direct your attention to the GitHub. I've got the final code here in the main branch. In addition to that, though, I'm going to start doing something on my channel because really the intention is not for me to impart grand wisdom from above to you. It's really to kind of code out how I would do something and then get feedback from you about how I might do it differently or better. And so what I'm going to do is add a branch here called Community Improvements. And my intention really is for you to listen to what we're doing here, walk through it with me, and then make your own suggestions, either with a PR or just commenting on a video. Either way, to try to see if we can't do something better together than just by ourselves. This is going to require a lot of humility from all of us just to be able to learn from each other in this way. And I hope that I can at least start us in a good way. And I hope that as we keep going, we can make it better. All right, so that's enough chatting. Let's go ahead and jump right in. Now we're going to start with the HTML, then we'll move to the CSS, and finally to the JavaScript, which will actually start with us writing all the CSS in that JavaScript file for the Accordion component. But without further ado, I'm going to open up here index.html, create that file, and then let's just use a boilerplate from Emmet here, and I'm going to call this Accordion component. All right, and then I also need a style.css file, style.css. And I'm going to link this up here. Let's move the title up top so it loads right away. And then down below, because this is blocking here, I'm going to add a style sheet link to my style.css. I'm in VS Code and I've got an extension called Live Server. If I right click and open this file, it should open right over here. And when we do stuff, it will dynamically generate the updates over on the right. Now with that being said, let's close this out and go ahead and start writing the HTML. We actually don't have too much to write here. We're going to have a main tag, and inside this main tag will be divs called containers. All right, and this basically is just going to set the width of our Accordion component, the max width available. So inside each container, we're going to have both a title, so this will be an H2. We're going to call this frequently asked questions. And then below the H2, we're going to have a div called Accordion. That'll be the class name on here. Now, I also actually want an ID on here. We're going to call this Accordion 1, so we can distinguish between the different accordions when we're initializing our JavaScript functions. Now, every accordion is going to be a series of buttons and divs with the class of Accordion button and Accordion panel. And the reason I'm doing a button here is because it gives us a bunch of keyboard events by default and kind of takes care of some of the accessibility things we would have to worry about otherwise. So I'll have something like, what questions do you have here for the button text? And again, all I have is a class here. We'll do everything else in JavaScript. And then I'm going to have an Accordion panel here. Again, this is just a div, and we'll have inside here a bunch of stuff, just whatever text we want. So I'll do lorem 40, pop that out, and then let's just copy this down a few times by holding Option, Shift, and the down arrow. If I save it here, it should all pop over this way, and it does. Now, I do want to actually add a link tag because when I tab through this, you can see it first highlights, if you can see that, the button, and then nothing else is highlighted because I don't have anything else on the page. But if I were to copy this down, let's go ahead and grab this button and this div, and I'll do the same thing, hold Option and Shift and hit the down arrow several times. Now when I come in here, it's going to tab through to those buttons because they're naturally accessible just with the tab key. Well, what happens if I come in here with an A tag, and we'll just point this to, I don't know, something, D, an ID of D. All right, we'll do link right here. If I do that, let's see, where is that? Down this way. And I start tabbing through stuff, it's actually now going to go ahead and jump to that link next. And I just want to make sure that we get all the tabbing correct. And so having a link inside here that we could tab to will help us do that. So that's all we're going to do. I'm actually now just going to take this entire accordion class, container class actually, and just duplicate everything in here to create a second component and then change the name to accordion2. So let me do that and I'll be right back with you. All right, I've saved it, and now you can see I've got up top frequently asked questions, and down here other asked questions. They both have the same number of questions, which I guess let's make one a little bit different just to make sure that all of our functionality works properly no matter what size accordion we've got. So I'm going to save that, and that's actually all the HTML we're going to write, except when we call our JavaScript file in a moment. I am going to jump over here to our style.css file, and the very first thing I'm going to do is just add a default clear or kind of reset on things. And then let's go ahead and kind of think through what we might need. What I'm going to do is focus primarily on the body, on the main tag, and on the container, and then we're going to take care of all the accordion CSS in the actual JavaScript file. Now to get my styling, the colors and everything, I've actually found a cool tool I want to show you called CSS Palette Generator. I'll give myself a little bit more space. You can see Josh here has created something where you can kind of give different depths to things with a really dynamic and helpful shadow generator. You can move this around and it actually moves the shadow. You can make it more or less crispy, which is just quite the name. And then you can also add some oomph, which again, I just love the way these things are named. You can also choose your background color, decide whether or not you want a tinted shadow, which typically you should probably, and then add or remove a resolution to make it, I think that makes it like more grainy or less grainy. However you adjust this GUI up here, it actually will give you the root styling for what that should look like. So you'll notice he's doing a couple things here. Number one, he gives you a default shadow color, and he's not wrapping this in HSL, even though it's HSL, because he's doing that below here so that he can dynamically generate these alpha channels. If you've watched my channel, that's how I typically like to do it too, so I like the way he's thinking. So what I've done is I've gone ahead, I'm just going to add a root over here. I've gone ahead and just copied, and I'm going to paste now my own thing I grabbed from this site. Now there's one little change I've made, and that is that I've added this hue variable so that I can use this color in a couple other things I want to have, a couple other colors I want to have on the site. I'm going to paste that in here, and you can see I've got hue, and then now I've got a background color, a surface color, and a text color that all use that same color. And basically this is almost white, this is definitely almost white, and this is almost black. And those are the colors we're going to use throughout the site and actually in our accordion as well. So let's come back over this way just so we can see the styling update automatically. And then I'm going to come down here. We're just going to do just a little bit in this CSS for the whole site. So I'm going to have the background color here. I'll have it be my HSL var of background. And again, because I declared those CSS variables without the HSL wrapper, I need to actually add it when I call it here down below. Also, depending on the size of these accordions, I may or may not have this scroll bar, which means every time I expand or contract it, it will actually add it or remove it. And I'd rather just always have it there so that I don't have that jumping around. So I'm going to add overflow, Y, and I'll do scroll. All right, next I'm going to come down here to main, and the main tag, I just want to have a display of grid, and then I'll have a gap of 4 rem, and I'll say place items center. And then align content center. And now it's time to set a font family. I've got a Google font over this way that I like. It's called Catamaran, I think, but I found it recently and I think it looks sharp. So I'm going to grab the 400 and the 600, and then let's grab this right here. I'm just going to add this to the CSS, so I'll use the import tag, and let's add this up top. And then I need the font family rules here, and I'm going to add that to the, let's just add it to the body itself. If I save that, you see it all updates for me, which is great. Everything inside this main tag, then I want to have a color of, let's see, what is it? Text, I think. Yeah. And then finally, I want padding on everything of 2 rem, and then that's up and down. Left and right, I want it to be more dynamic. So rather than doing media queries, I'm going to use a property called clamp, which is really cool. I've done a video before on it that I probably overcomplicated, but basically you have a minimum size you want it to be, so 1 rem at the smallest. Then you set something based on the view width or some other kind of dynamic option here. And then finally, I'll have 2 rem as the highest, so it'll never get bigger than 2 rem. All right, and then I'm going to come down here on the H2 and I'll have a font size. We're going to do the same thing. So we'll do clamp 2 rem, 4 view width, and 4 rem. And then I'll do font weight here of 600, that larger font that I grabbed, and text align center to keep it in the center of the screen on smaller devices, and then line height of 1.1, and finally we'll do a margin bottom of 1 rem. So if I save that all, that should all work properly. Just 2 little things left in the CSS file itself, and then we'll be in JavaScript the rest of the time. So I'm going to use an is selector here and grab all my links just so that they're not that weird blue color. That's default, and I'm going to grab them when they're links or when they're visited. And for both of these, I'm going to say that the color needs to be HSL. Let's see, the text, like that. So let's see, do I have an extra? Yeah, an extra one there. I come down this way. Where is my link? Took me a second here. Here it is right here, this little tiny link, just so you can see that it actually did take effect. All right, finally, let's actually go back up here. We've got the main, and then let's do the container tag right here. That's what wraps both of these accordions themselves. Here I just want a max width of 900 pixels, and then I want, let's see, a width of 100%. So if I save that, and I come and try to pull this wider than 900, it's going to cap it at 900, and you can set that to whatever you want. All right, so we've got all that set up. Now let's go ahead and let's pull up the sidebar again and add one more file. This will be called accordion.js. In here, we'll say console.log, hi, and then I'll jump over to my index.html page. And at the bottom here, I'm going to add a script tag with the source of accordion.js. All right, if I save that here, I should be able to pull up down here and I see hi. Okay, so it is connected. Let's go ahead and write the CSS we're going to need for the component. Now the reason I'm writing it in the JavaScript is that way I don't have to have it as part of the main style sheet of whatever site I'm using, but I can still use the same variables because that style sheet would have loaded first. Now I can reference those in this JavaScript file, and just whenever I have an accordion on a page, it will dynamically add this CSS to the page so that the accordion will have the styling it needs. So in order to do that, there's several ways. We could just write a function and then call it automatically. But what I'd like to do instead is to actually do an IFI, which is an immediately invoked function. We'll say load accordion CSS or something like that. And the way you do this is just write a function like normal. You wrap it in parentheses and then call it right away like this. So I'll say document.body.insert adjacent HTML. And this takes 2 things. It takes both a placement, so we'll say before the end of that tag, and then also after a comma, it takes whatever string of HTML we want to add. So I'm going to do in backticks here, and then just add a style tag like this. And now what I want to do is inside the style tags, I'm going to add styling for the accordion itself, which is the div wrapper around both the buttons and those divs with the class of accordion panel. Here we're going to have display of grid, and then a gap of 1 rem. Now if I save it, this should load automatically because again, it's just immediately invoked function. So it's just loading as soon as I save this since the file's already attached to this HTML document. Now below the accordion, we had a couple other things. We had our accordion button, and then we also had our accordion panel. Let's work first of all on the button itself. So the button itself, I'm going to have both the text that's already in here, this text node. I'm also going to add an icon over this way. Now, we don't have that added yet. We're going to add that in the JavaScript later on. So you're just going to have to imagine it for now, and I'll go back to the live example to show you what we're doing in a second. In short, though, we want to say display flex and separate these 2 things. So first of all, align items center, make sure that vertically they're spaced out the same way. And then justify content, space between. Ensures that they're spaced to the sides of that button. And then let's add some padding. We'll do 0.7 rem and 1.5 rem. That's left and right now. The color itself, to override the default in the browser, I'm going to use my var of text. And again, that's already in the style sheet for the whole site, so I can access that here as well. Now, I mentioned that box shadow that we grabbed from the site I showed you, but we haven't actually used it yet. So we're going to use it right here. So first of all, let's go ahead and add a background color just so we can see what this looks like. So we'll do HSL, and then in here, var of our background. Or I think maybe that was surface. I think it's surface. Okay, so if I save it here, you see that actually shows up, and that's what I want. Now let's get rid of that border first of all. So we'll say border 1 pixel, solid and transparent. I'm doing it here because I do actually want to have a border on hover, and so to be able to transition between the two, I need something here already. So I'll save that, and you should see that pull up. Now, let's go ahead and add the surface, box shadow surface thing. So we'll do a shadow, and then I'm going to use the variable we created, var, well, we got from that generator, shadow, elevation, and I've got a couple different options. If I come over here, let's see, where was it? Right here. So I've got low, medium, and high, and that corresponds to the GUI editor that we saw earlier. So if I say low, it's going to have just a very faint shadow. If I say medium, it'll have a slightly larger one, and if I say high, it will be massive. But they look really, I think, really great, and they look natural. I'm going to set this to medium. I just think that looks the best in this particular use case. Okay, I've got a couple other things. We'll have a border radius of 0.3 rem. And then to make sure people know that they can click on it, I'm going to have a cursor of pointer. And let's go ahead and add a transition here. We'll do it on the background color. We'll do 250 milliseconds ease in and out. And then we'll also do it on the border itself. So 250 milliseconds ease in and out. If I save that here, I should be able to eventually, when I add a hover state, see that kind of pull in and out. So let's go ahead and do that now. I'm going to copy this accordion button down. And this time what we want to look for is with an is selector, anytime it's on hover or it's on focus. When those two things are the case, I'm going to change a couple things. That will all stay the same. The border will change. That will all stay the same. I could remove the box shadow, I suppose, if I wanted to, but I kind of like it to stay on there because it looks so good. And then I'll remove transition. We don't need that. Okay, so it's just the background color, and the border is all we're transitioning between, and that's actually all I want to worry about. Now, because the way we wrote these variables, just like the generator we saw, we can actually come in here and write alpha channels dynamically as well. So I'll say 0.2 for this one, and then here I want HSL var text, which is that dark color, and we'll say 0.34. So if I save it here, you should see that when I come over here and hover, I actually get this little cool effect. Now, if I use my tab key, you'll notice that I get this really dark default blue border. And so I do actually want to change that up as well. So if I come in here, and we don't need an is selector, we're just going to look at one thing, which is the focus within. When that's the case, I don't want a border. I want to worry about the outline, which is the default. And I'm going to set this to 2 pixels. Other than that, though, it's going to stay the same. Now when I come in here and hover, it's just a thicker version of that hover state, so you really are sure that you're focused in on that if you're using the keyboard. Now I mentioned that we're going to have an icon that we're going to show here in a second, so even though it's not part of the DOM yet, we're going to go ahead and just add some really basic styling here. So we're going to give it a class of accordion icon. We'll say pointer events, none, and then transition, we're going to do transform, and 180 milliseconds here. And then I'm going to add a cubic Bezier curve, but you could do something like ease. And if I were to come in here to any of these, whenever you're looking at these, let's see if I can pull this up. You can click in Chrome here and actually adjust this cubic Bezier curve yourself. So on the screen next to you, I'm going to go ahead and grab what I've got set just so I don't have to rediscover one that works well. You can copy this or come up with your own. I'm adding a transition because we're going to actually flip that arrow 180 degrees depending if it's clicked or not clicked. And the thing we're going to use to trigger that is the aria label here, aria expanded equals true. And whenever that's the case, then I want to look inside of that. That'll be done on the button. I want to look inside of that to see the accordion icon. And here's where we're going to actually shift stuff around. So I'll say transform, and this will be a rotate 180 degrees. And then I'm actually going to leave this transition on as well so it flips back the other way. Now the only thing we have left is actually the accordion panel. So that's what I've got down here. And I'm going to say display of none by default with a gap of 0.5 rem because eventually we're going to add a display grid here. And we'll have a background color. And this color will be HSL var surface. Padding here, we're going to use that same clamp idea. So we'll do a 1.5 rem. That's up and down or left and right, either way, because we're only going to add this kind of in both directions. 3 view width will be kind of what it's trying to stick at, and it will never get bigger than 2.5 rem. And finally, we're going to have the same border radius. So border radius, a point radius of 0.3 rem. Now, whenever we trigger this panel as active, we're going to do it by adding removing the hidden attribute. So what I can do is use a not selector here and say whenever it does not have, and in brackets here, hidden equals true, because we're going to have hidden equals true anytime it is inactive. So I'll come in here and say display grid in that case. So right now nothing really changes because we haven't added any of this, but that's what we're going to do here in a second. All right, so we've got everything ready, and now we just need to actually write the JavaScript. Now I know we've been playing around with JavaScript so far, but what we're actually going to do is write real JavaScript, not CSS, in it. Now because we've got two different accordions and we want them to both have the same functionality, I want to write this in such a way that the code itself can be reusable. And so we're going to do that with something called classes in JavaScript. Now classes are kind of like sugar, semantic sugar on top of prototypes. And if you don't know what prototypes are, basically if you come into your terminal here, I can say like const array hi bye. I like that one. Let's do that. And then I can say array 1, and it just shows me those. But if I do console.dir array 1, it's going to actually show me not just the array itself, but it'll also show me a prototype, which is like the mama array. So things like concat and constructor and all these kinds of things, these live on the array itself, the kind of the default array in JavaScript. That's why we have things like map and pop and push. These are all methods that live on the capital A array. Now you can actually define your own classes, your own prototypes, and then basically use functionality anytime one of those is used. So we're going to create a class for accordion, a capital A accordion, and then we're going to pass in each of these accordions as an instance, just like this array is an instance of the mama array. We're going to pass in an instance for each of these accordions, and then we've got a lot of the same functionality built in to the prototype itself that we're going to generate. So let's refresh here. The way we're going to do this is we're going to add a class with accordion capital A here. And then inside here, you need something that creates the object, the instances of this. So we're going to add something called a constructor. And in here, we're going to add both an element that we're going to pass in and possible options that we will pass in. We'll say that this.acc, so the instance, we're going to add a property called acc on it. That will just be the element that we've passed in. And then we're going to have this.options be equal to either the options, or if we don't pass in any options, we can just have an empty object like this. So let's go ahead and save this, and let's write a function down here that will actually call this accordion or create these instances of this accordion. So that will be equal to function, and we're going to call this create accordion, and we're going to pass in the same thing that we have in our constructors, the L and the options. And then we'll say that we want to actually look at the DOM for whatever element was passed in. So document.query selector all, and we're going to look for the L that was passed in. And then for each of these, we want to look at the accordion that was passed in with a little arrow function here. We're going to then say we want a new accordion. And again, we're going to pass in the accordion that we're looping through each of these elements. And then we'll also pass in options. So let's throw some semicolons on here and save this. And right now, nothing too much is going on, but we haven't used this yet. We will in a second. So what we're going to do is go ahead and come down here. We're going to just call this create accordion. Here, we're going to pass in an element. So the element in this case, we're going to have be accordion 1, our first accordion, and then we'll pass in an empty object right now for the options. So that's all we're going to do, and that should actually use this class to create an instance of accordion. Now, what we want to do is figure out on each of the accordions, basically, what are the buttons and what are the panels. So let's do that next. So I'll come in here, and we're going to say this.buttons is equal to, we've got the instance, the accordion that we just declared up top here, this.acc. So we're going to say, let's look inside of that. So that.query selector all, and we're looking for anything with a class of accordion button. We did ask the user to basically add that, we're the user in this case, to any buttons that should be the accordion buttons. Now this will give us a node list. What I'd rather have though is an array. So I'm going to actually wrap this here in an array. And we're just going to spread this in. So it'll actually give us an array back. Now let's do the same thing, except this time we don't want buttons. This time we want panel, or panels, I guess, and accordion panel here. So now on each of these instances, in this case we've just passed in 1, but in each of these instances, we're going to have an accordion that relates to whatever the query selector is that we passed in. We're also going to have options here that have been passed in. We'll have buttons and we'll have our panels. Now, once we've got those things, there are several things we need to add to make this fully responsive and especially accessible. And so let's go ahead and add a method we're going to write below called this.addMetadata. So for each of these, as they are generated, we're going to go ahead and call this method down below. So I'm going to write this down here, add metadata like this. And because it's inside a class, I don't have to use the function keyword. In fact, I can't. I'm just going to add it like that. What do I want to do to make this really accessible? Well, I need to add a couple of things to basically connect each button to the panel and each panel to the button. And then I also need to add some aria attributes to say whether or not the button has expanded the section it's supposed to control and all that kind of stuff. So let's go ahead and do that now. So let's take this.buttons, so the buttons connected to this instance, whatever instance is being worked on. We'll say for each of these, I want the button. Actually, we need to add this in parentheses here, both the button and I want the index. And then I'm going to write an arrow function here and say for each of these buttons in this accordion that I've passed in, this instance of the accordion, I want to do those things we talked about. So first of all, I want an ID on each of them that's unique to it. So there's two ways we need to make this unique. We need to make it unique in the sense that this is special, it's connected to this specific accordion. And then the other way we're going to make it unique is connected to the index it's on. All right. And since we should have the same number of panels and buttons, we can then use the index number to basically decide which one to open. So I'm going to say button, and then I'm going to do a dash. And here I at least want to, in backticks, add the index. Now that works just fine. In fact, if I save it, let's see, it should actually update over this way. Let's grab this button and see if anything has been added. So yeah, I've got a button /0. So that's great. Something is actually being added to that. But if I pass in both of these down here, so instead of doing the ID, if I say accordion like this, I'm going to have a button 0 here. And then when I come down to this second instance, this one will also be a button of 0. So you can see this one will never really work because it's always going to look up the first ID on the page. So I need to not only add something that makes it unique within its own accordion, but something that makes it unique on the page entirely. So in order to do that, let's go ahead and add a unique identifier here. So we could call it like UUID, but let's just call it ID, all right, for the entire accordion itself. To get a random number, I'm going to say math.random. Then I'm going to take this random math number and I'm going to set it to a string. So this will include numbers and all this kind of stuff based on whatever, or letters based on whatever numbers I receive back from math.random. Then I can use the .substring method that lives on this string, and I can say I want 2 and 16. That should give me a string of either numbers or letters. That means I can come in here and add that unique identifier to the whole accordion itself. So I'll say this.id, and that will actually pull from the instance here, and then this index pulls from the index in the buttons array. So if I save this, now I'm getting this unique ID here, and it should have characters enough to actually be unique. And I mean, I suppose there's a small chance you could have two accordions with the exact same random number, but if that's happening, you've got other bad luck headed your way. Okay, so we've got an ID set now for each of the buttons, and we're going to repeat most of this for the panel. So once we do it once, we can use it in both ways. In addition to adding an ID, we also want to set the attribute for each of these. We're going to set it aria expanded attribute to false by default. Now you might remember that we actually have an option we could pass in that says whether or not the first one should be expanded by default. So let's go ahead and add a placeholder here, and we'll say to do add first expanded option. So we'll come back and do that in a little bit. All right, next we want to add an attribute. So set attribute, and this one will be aria controls. What this is going to do is it's going to point to whatever panel that this controls, and that will connect the two basically for assistive technologies. So what I want to set that to is the exact same thing actually up here, like this, except in this case, I want to change this to say panel instead. Now, right now, this ID hasn't been written. We'll do that in a second, but just so you know, that's what we're doing. So we're connecting the panel by its ID, and we're eventually going to connect the panel to the button by this ID. The next thing we need to do is actually add in our accordion icon. Now, I've gone ahead and pulled up a tab over here for tabular icons, and they've got some cool icons. I'm going to pull up the chevron, and let's look at the chevron down. And if I click it, it just copies the SVG to my clipboard. What I can do then is say I want that individual button to have some adjacent HTML added to it. We'll use the same positioning element here of before end, and then in backticks, I'm just going to add this SVG. Now there are a couple things I want to change. Number one, I want to get rid of these classes and replace it with my own, which was Accordion icon. Two, let's change these to 44 on the width and the height. And then finally, the stroke, I'm just going to set it to current color, which will take the parent color and apply it to the SVG on this stroke. And that parent color should be that dark text color we have. So if I save it here and jump back over this way, if we did it all correctly, yeah, they show up right here for each of the buttons in this accordion and in the second one, since we went ahead and initialized both down below just a second ago. All right, so let's come back over this way. And if I can keep all this straight, I'm going to come down here now below here. This is the class itself being closed off. This is the function add metadata. So in between here, we now want to do the same thing for our panels. So this dot panels dot for each, and I want to look at both the panel and the index. Now here again, I'm going to go ahead and add a few things. We want the panel ID, and that will be this, since the button is going to connect to that. So we'll say this, or I guess panel.id, and that will be equal to what we just copied. And then I want to set a couple of attributes. So I'm going to say set attribute, and the attribute I'm going to set, first of all, is role. And this will be set to region. And region is a very generic aria role, basically, that just says this is important. At least that's how I understand it. The next thing I want to set is aria labeled by. And this is the same as, let's see, what do we have on the button? Controls. So controls says here's what it controls, and this basically points back to the thing that controls it. And we're going to actually use that same thing we copied down earlier. So, except this time we're going to change it to the ID of the button itself. And again, because both arrays have the same length, we can use this index, and it should reference the same number in the array. And then lastly here, both of them, or everyone, should have a hidden attribute that equals, by default, it will equal true. Now again, we need to add a little to-do here for ourselves. So we'll say to-do, and our to-do here is we need to add an option for the first expanded. Okay, so if we save this, now all of these should have all of these attributes and things applied to them naturally. If I come in here, I'm not seeing that, so I've got an error, this dot panels for each. Okay, now these should work, and now you see those actually all hide by themselves. And so I've got these all stacked up perfectly, which is great. Now I've got some weird spacing things going on here. Let's see, what do we not add? So this H2, this container, I think maybe we need to add some kind of gap on the grid itself, or we could do it on the accordion. Let's go back to the style here, and let's just add it on, let's see, gap for rem. Oh, that was the problem. So I did have it, it just didn't save. Does that work? No. That wasn't the problem, but if I look over here, I'm noticing that this container here is inside the other container, which is not what I want. So that's the problem. Let's come back to our HTML then. Somehow I got mixed up. Let's connect that container. Let's see. All right, I'm going to fix this and be back with you. You don't need to watch me do this. I just had to move all that one tag over, and now we've got the proper gap showing there. Okay, come back down. Stuff happens. All right, now if I come back, what I was going to try to show you here is if I look inside here, I'm actually now seeing that this button has an ID. It points to aria controls, this exact panel. It says aria expanded equals false. And if I come down to a panel, it has labeled by, added, hidden true, role, region, all that added dynamically in JavaScript. So we don't have to remember that when we're writing HTML. Okay, so I've got all that set up. The next thing I want to do is, in addition to adding metadata, I also want to attach some event listeners. So attach event listeners. This will actually be mostly the rest of the work we need to do. We're going to come back around and refactor a couple of things, but let's go ahead and come down, let's see, inside the class still, and write a function called attach event listeners. And I'm going to attach the event listeners to the accordion themselves rather than each of the individual buttons. We can just deal with one event listener, and we're going to add stuff for both click events and for keyboard events. So let's start with click events. In fact, maybe let's do this. Let's comment out here click events, just so we can keep it organized. So we'll say this.acc.add event listener, and we're going to listen for a click, and then let's capture the event itself, and let's go ahead and say console.log e.target. Now, e.target is the thing that's actually being clicked on. So if I come over here, I should be able to click anywhere and actually get something. And you see I'm getting the button. If I click in between, I'll get the accordion class. And if I were to click the icon and I didn't have pointer events none, it would actually give me the icon itself, which is why we added that so we can control what we're clicking. So anytime we ever click in here, we're always going to be clicking the button, never the icon or anything like that. So we know what we're getting. What we want to do is figure out whenever we've clicked on one of these buttons, what do we do? Well, the first thing is let's go ahead and write a little guard clause here that say if e.target does not equal, so e.target.classList.contains accordion button, like that. So if it doesn't contain button, I just want to jump out of this because that's the only thing I really care about. Okay, so I've got that set up. Now I want to figure out when it's clicked, I need to figure out some info about the button that was clicked. So the first thing I want to know is if it's expanded. So we'll say is expanded equals e.target.getAttribute, and the attribute we're getting is aria expanded. And we're going to basically see if that equals true. Now notice I'm not type checking, I'm not doing 3 because sometimes this will be a string and sometimes it'll be a Boolean depending on how it gets added. So I'm just going to do 2 to make sure that it all works properly. I'm getting an error here because I closed this off prematurely. Here's what I want it to look like. All right, so now I know whether or not the button itself is expanded. Now we are going to add, again, down here, options for one panel only. So that's if we only want one panel to be expanded at its time. We'll have a to-do that we're going to add in a little bit. So let's kind of have a placeholder for that. Now what I want to know is if it is expanded, then I want to do some things. So first of all, I want to say e.target, this is the button itself, .setAttribute. If it already is expanded, that means now I want to close it. So I'll say aria expanded. Now I want that to be set to false. So if that's the case, that's what I want. Then I'm going to say this.panels, and I need to find a way to reference the index of this panel itself. So let's actually pull out of this just for a second, and let's add one more thing we want to know about the button. So what we want to know is the index of the button that was clicked on. We can figure that out by saying this.buttons.find index of the button that was passed in. Let's see, we need, I guess it would be e.target. So if I save this, come over here, let's go ahead and console log this index. And if I click here, oh, and I didn't even finish this statement here, sorry about that. So I need to, first of all, grab the button itself. So just looping through these things and say the button.id, does it equal the e.target.id? So now let's go ahead and console log the index. I click here, that's 4, that's 3, that's 2, that's 1, and this is 0. All right, so this is the right order of stuff, and I know what the index is that I'm getting when I click. So let's use that. Now if I come back down here to look at the this.panels, and then we're going to grab the index of whatever button's been clicked on. We want the corresponding panel to expand. So I'm going to say set attribute, and this will be hidden now is equal to true because we're, again, closing it. And I'm going to go ahead and add this as a string just to be consistent with what I did up top here with equals false. All right, now that's if it's expanded. We could do else, but I'll just do another if statement here just to make sure it's very clear what we're doing. And here what we want is to set this obviously to true. And then down here, we don't want to set an attribute. We want to remove an attribute, and the attribute we want to remove is hidden. So if that's gone, it should actually display for us. So that means if I come in here and I click, that should expand out. This should expand out, and all that works properly. I am noticing that the panels themselves don't have the background color that we want. So let's go ahead and fix that right now. So panel, let's see, HSL surface. And that looks correct so far as I can tell. Let's change this to text just to see if it actually changes anything. It's not. So there must be some problem in the CSS up here. Well, let's see if the arrow is turning around. So the arrow is not turning, so it's something up this way we must have forgotten to add that's breaking everything. And I think I see the error here. I just don't have a quotation mark here. Let's see if that changes anything. Yeah, now it flips and everything works. Okay. Sorry about that. You probably saw that a long time ago. So we've added our click events and that works properly. In fact, if I come over here and use the keyboard, it works the same way because that picks up the same event here. So now what we're going to do is worry about the keyboard events. Let's see, I guess we need to pull this down. We're going to run this as well though on the accordion itself. And so whenever it's selected, we're going to say add event listener. What we're listening for is key down. And then we're going to grab the event. Let's go ahead and do the same check we did up top here. So if it's not on and a button itself, we just want to go ahead and get out. Nothing matters to us. It's only when those buttons are selected that we want to actually adjust things. So we're also going to do the same index. So let's go ahead and grab this and I'm going to copy that, come down here. Oh, sorry about that. Come down here. Let's grab the index of that. Now what we're going to do is just do a little switch statement here. So our switch statement will be on the key itself, which will be the e.key. And we're going to basically create different cases. You can see this already kind of scaffold some of this out for me automatically. What I'm looking for is different keys that are hit. So depending on the key that's hit, so in this case it would be like the home key, then on each of these I want to e.prevent default to basically make them not do their default behavior. And again, this is only when I've actually got an accordion button selected that I'm preventing the default. But what I want is this .buttons 0.focus. So in other words, wherever I'm at, I want to jump to the very first button in that accordion. All right, then I'll break from that and let's go ahead and copy this down. We'll do another case. In this case, let's look at the end. So if the end is the case, then I want to say this .buttons, and then in here, we're going to look for this .buttons.length -1. So we're going to go to the last one and focus in on that. And then we'll break from that. Now we've got two other arrows to worry about. One would be arrow up. There's two use cases we need to worry about. We will go ahead and prevent the default, but what we want to do is do a little check here. So what we're looking for is if the index equals 0, so if it's the very first button, then what I want to do is do this. So focus on the last one, so loop back around. Else, I just want to say this .buttons index -1. And that's what I want to focus on. Again, we're going to break from that. I'm going to write one more case, and this will be for arrow down. In this case, I don't want it to change anything off the 0. I want to actually say if it's the last button. So button, let's see, buttons.length -1. If that's the case, if it's the last one, then what I want to do is go back and loop up to the first. So 0. Otherwise, I want to say index +1. All right, and I don't need anything for my default, so I'm just going to go ahead and save that. Now I've got some kind of syntax error. I can tell because I've got this yelling at me, these brackets, so let's figure out what's going on. All right, I added an extra parentheses here. Okay, everything else should be working. That means I should be able to come in here and actually click on here and expand this out, hit the down arrow, hit the up arrow. If I'm at the top and hit the up arrow, it should loop back around, but it can't. All right, so we've got some kind of problem. 126. Reading of 4. And you probably see the error. I have button here. It needs to be buttons. That's the name of the array. So now if I come back in here, I hit up, it should go down. If I hit down, I got the same problem because I copied it down twice. So let's try that again. If I go up, it should go down. If I go down, it should go back up. I should be able to go like this. If I hit the end, it's not working. Let's see, why is the end not working? Well, that's because I kept doing the same thing over and over again. That's why. If you're going to make mistakes, do it the same way every time. All right, so I hit end or home, it should jump back and forth there. Okay, cool. So we've got two other things we need to worry about. One is the different options we might pass in, and two is I want to move the actual running of the function to the HTML where we'll try to initialize it there. So let's first of all do that. So I'm going to take this, create an accordion and get rid of this for now. And then what we're going to do is make this a module. So I'll say export default like this. And then I'm going to come over to the HTML. We're going to come down to the bottom. What I'm going to do is actually say this needs to be type of module. And then inside here is where we're actually going to import that default function. So I'm going to say import default. We can call it whatever we want. Let's call it create accordion. That's what it is. From, and then a relative path here, accordion.js. Then what I can do is say create accordion, and I can pass in whatever I want. So I can actually do the same thing. Let's see, did I copy that? Yeah. So if I do that, everything should work like normal. Yeah, everything works just like it did in the file itself when we ran it. What this allows us to do, though, is to actually pass in different options over here in the HTML when we initialize it. I can either do it for both of them and make them the same, or let's go ahead and do this. Let's make one different than the other just to make sure that they're both working. So for this accordion 1, we're going to have a couple different options we're going to pass in, or we could pass in if we wanted to. First option we're going to have is called one panel only. We're going to set this to false on this first one, and then we'll have another one called first expanded. This is just to show that you can pass in things like this, and you can add whatever other ones you want. In this case, I'm going to have this for accordion 1, and then for the second accordion, which has an accordion 2 ID, here, let's change this one to true, and let's change this one to false. That's how I have it in my example. So now right now these aren't doing anything, but we actually first of all need to go ahead and write some things so that it'll actually adjust them. So let's come back over to our accordions and let's check out our to-dos. So we've got to-do there. Let's see, I think the first one is right here. So let's first of all look at what should happen if we have our first expanded option set to true. So I'm going to say if this dot options, so the options that were passed in for this specific instance of the accordion, dot first expanded, so if that equals true, and if the index equals 0. In other words, I only want to affect the first one because we are, after all, looking at the first expanded. If that's the case, then I want to look at the button itself and say I want to set an attribute on it. And the attribute is going to be the aria expanded, and that will be set to true. Now you see when I save it here, I'm actually indicating that this is open by this thing switching around. So I know that I actually changed this to expanded equals true. Now we just need to do the same thing for the panel. So let's get rid of this to do. We got that out of the way. And let's go down. Let's see, not one panel only. To do right down here. Same thing here. We're going to say if this dot options dot first expanded and the index equals 0. Then I want to say panel dot remove attribute, and I'm going to remove hidden. So if I say this, that should expand and open automatically. So that's by default. Of course, I can close it, but by default, it's going to be open because I have that set to true. This one I have set to false, so it's not open. So we've got that one out of the way. It leaves us one other that we need to worry about. This is options for one panel only. In other words, when I click, I want to actually figure out whether or not only one panel should be open or if all of them should stay open. So here we're going to do another little if statement. If this dot options dot one panel only, if that equals true, then I'll say this dot panels dot for each. And what I want to do is just go through and loop and close every panel. So I'll say panel, and then I'm going to say the panel dot set attribute hidden should be equal to true. Now this closes them all, and then of course whatever one is selected will then open afterwards down here, which is great. So if I come down here and open this one, and I then open this, it should close the first one, and it does. All right, so both of those options work, and now we're just passing that in down this way. Now, so far as I can tell, that looks like a completed project to me. In fact, if we pull this open this way, hopefully you'll see your finished work. So you can see you can click these and open them up and close them however you want to. Now you might want to do some other things like make this button text a little bit bigger. You can totally do that if you want. Maybe let's do that real quick just for completion's sake while I make one more appeal to you that as you're watching this, if you look around and you're like, hey, you know what, I would do this a little bit differently, then go ahead and just do a PR on that branch or leave a comment below. How might you do this a little bit differently than the way I've done it here? So I'm going to say 0.15 rem. Let's do 3 view width and 2.5 rem. All right, and if I close this out, you'll now see that these expand as I pull it open, and as I shut it, maybe that's a little bit too big. Let's do 2 rem, something like that. I hope this has been a fun project for you. If you have questions for me, let me know. Thanks so much for watching. I hope to catch you in the next one. Happy coding.